Today we'll be looking at my take on a posture which is characteristic to Meyer's system, Schlussel, or the key. While the posture itself is quite simple, there's actually quite a lot to using it effectively while fencing. To go through that would take an entire workshop or a class session, so here we're going to cover some of the basics. This posture, with its crossed arms, sometimes draws criticism. This might be because people expect it to be used statically, which in fencing would look a little like this. In figuring out another approach to using Schlussel, we need to return to first principles and look at two guard positions, Flug and Ox. Let's take a look at a typical transition you might see from some people when they change between the two. It's a little exaggerated, but in this case you can see the circular movement of the shoulders pivoting around that front shoulder line. Pivot up, pivot down. If we stop the motion for a second, you'll see that most of the work here is being done by the small muscles of the shoulder, resulting in a weaker structure. We can contrast this with an alternative approach, which uses a lifting and pushing action instead of that pivoting. The final positions we move into are identical. We're moving from one on-point position to another. If we look from the front though, we can see several major differences. This linear lift gives us good control over our sword and helps us maintain structure. It also means that at any stage we can abort the action and move straight into a thrust. Notice also that this bicep curl and press action recruits a totally different set of muscles to the pivoting action. Let's look at the same motion from the other side. The crossed hand position leads to an interesting outcome. As we transition between the guards on this side, we actually pass through the position of Schlussel. This should come as no real surprise. After all, Meyer tells us that the guards are literally transition points between other motions. We often see people using this transitional Schlussel unconsciously while they're fencing, typically as they're hunting for openings between high and low guard positions. Often ending, of course, with a thrust. So let's move on to this motion. I tend to prefer a modular style of fencing where a single body mechanic becomes useful for many techniques. Look for example at our cutting mechanic with the turning of the hips. We can apply a fundamentally identical mechanic to thrusting from Schlussel. The only change is with the extension of the arms. Yet even this shares a common principle with cutting. We can visualize a string attaching the point of our sword and pulling us directly towards our opponent. You can actually try this in practice by having someone pull the tip of your sword towards them. Feel the body motion as the sword and the hip unwind when they do this. Then emulate this in your own motions. By squeezing the arms in and down slightly while we're thrusting, we avoid winging them out to the sides and keep a better structure in the thrust. When entering from a distance with the technique, we simply allow the hip action to carry us forward and move into a passing step by pushing off with the rear leg. Aside from the thrust, this puts us into an extended long point position, which is a versatile position to fence from. Meyer's thrusting is typically used as a provocation. The attack to the face draws a response from my opponent. I allow my blade to flow off with an ablaufen and cut around to the other side. If you really want to feel like a Meyer fencer, then you can cut all the way through to the ground. Though in some tournaments, hitting the ground with the tip of your sword is a penalty, so I wouldn't recommend it. Even if our opponent counterattacks aggressively down the center line, our ablaufen should provide enough protection that we can cut around. Now let's see it all demonstrated in context as part of Meyer's first play of Schlussel. If our opponent presses us with an attack as we enter with the thrust, we simply turn the long edge against it to thrust in opposition. This is effectively a form of absetzen. The direction we turn the blade depends on the incoming threat. In this example we see several high thrusts, but if the threat is low we can use a low thrust instead. And now from the front, noticing how we offset their blade with a strong of our own. Taken to its conclusion, we can add this motion to the winding we performed in our last video to arrive at Meyer's second play of Schlussel. In summary, we should remember that Schlussel is a transitional position. It relies on a lifting and pushing motion, and it provides a natural movement into a thrust, which uses a similar mechanic to other techniques. Thanks for watching.